The man across from Sophia sneered, "Ugly," and left her sitting alone at the upscale bistro. Until the vampire king at the neighboring table stood up, his dark eyes promising retribution. What she didn't realize was that vampires mate for eternity, and he'd just claimed her as his own with a single protective glance. The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the white tablecloth as Sophia Martinez smoothed her navy dress for the third time, her fingers trembling against the simple cotton fabric. 28 years of careful invisibility had taught her to choose muted colors, to take up as little space as possible, but tonight she had dared to hope. Her co-worker Jessica had promised Marcus was different, kind, someone who would see past her quiet exterior to the woman beneath. The reservation at Celestine had cost Sophia a week's grocery budget, but she had wanted to prove she belonged in places like this, surrounded by couples who laughed easily over wine that cost more than her monthly bus pass. She checked her phone again, the blue screen casting harsh shadows under her eyes. 7:43. He was 13 minutes late. The waiter with silver at his temples had already approached twice, his polite smile growing thinner each time she declined to order. Around her, conversations flowed in languages she recognized from the books she shelved at the downtown library, fragments of French and Italian that sounded like music compared to the silence at her table. She had practiced conversation starters in the mirror that morning, rehearsing questions about his work in real estate, his travels, anything to fill the spaces between words that always seemed to yawn wider when she tried to speak. Her reflection had looked hopeful then, almost pretty with the soft light from her bedroom window, catching the amber flecks in her brown eyes. Now she felt exposed under the restaurant's unforgiving brightness, every imperfection magnified. The front door chimed and she looked up, heart stuttering with relief. Marcus stood in the entrance, scanning the room with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. Tall and broad-shouldered in an expensive suit, he carried himself like a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His gaze found her and stopped, something shifting in his expression that made her stomach clench. She raised her hand in a tentative wave and watched his face change completely. The polite interest died, replaced by something colder than disappointment. He approached her table with the measured steps of someone walking to an execution, his jaw set in a line she had seen before on the faces of people who had to deliver bad news. He did not sit down. He stood beside the chair across from her, one hand resting on its back, and looked her up and down with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating livestock. The silence stretched until she felt compelled to break it, her voice smaller than she had intended when she said hello. He did not return the greeting. Instead, he shook his head slowly, his mouth twisting into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "Jessica did not mention you were this plain," he said, the words falling between them like stones. The neighboring tables seemed to quiet, conversations pausing as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar burn of shame she had carried since childhood. She opened her mouth to respond, to apologize for not being what he had expected, but he was not finished. "This is not what I signed up for. The dress looks like you bought it at a thrift store, which you probably did, and you did not even try with your hair or makeup. I have standards, and frankly, you are not even close to meeting them." He pulled out his phone and checked it ostentatiously. "I am going to save us both some time and embarrassment. You are ugly, plain and simple, and I am not going to waste my evening pretending otherwise." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Tell Jessica not to set me up with any more charity cases." The words hit her like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. She sat frozen as he walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor until they were swallowed by the general murmur of the restaurant. The conversations around her resumed, but she caught the sideways glances, the whispered comments that followed in his wake. The waiter appeared at her elbow, his face carefully neutral, as he asked if she would like to see the dessert menu. She shook her head, unable to trust her voice. and stared at the untouched breadbasket between the empty place settings. Her reflection stared back at her from the surface of her water glass, distorted and fractured. 12 tables away, a figure who had been observing the modern world with the detached interest of a scientist studying insects felt something ancient and primal stir in his chest. Lucien Dracul had chosen this corner table specifically for its shadows, for the way the pillar beside it concealed him from casual observation. 800 years of existence had taught him to be careful about when and where he allowed himself to be seen. Tonight, he had been conducting one of his periodic examinations of human society, noting how the rituals of courtship had evolved since his last careful observation decades ago. He had been content to watch and catalog, to update his understanding of the species he had once been part of, but now stood apart from by choice and necessity. Then the man called Marcus had spoken those words, and everything changed. Lucian's enhanced senses had been monitoring the restaurant's emotional landscape as a matter of habit, filtering through the contentment of couples sharing intimate dinners, the nervous excitement of first dates, the comfortable familiarity of long marriages. But Marcus unleashed his cruelty on the woman at table 7. Her heartbreak hit Lucian like a physical force. Her scent changed, shifting from the light fragrance of hope to something deeper and more complex, tinged with salt and sorrow. Her pulse, which he had been dimly aware of as part of the restaurant's gentle symphony of life, began to stammer and skip like a damaged record. Something inside him that had been dormant for centuries suddenly roared to life. He found himself standing before he had consciously decided to move, his chair scraping against the floor with enough force to crack the wooden leg. The vampire king who had ruled the night for 8 centuries, who had negotiated treaties with werewolf packs and mediated disputes between ancient covens, felt his careful control slip away like sand through his fingers. His dark eyes tracked Marcus's retreating form with predatory intensity, cataloging weakness and calculating vulnerability with the instincts of an apex predator. But it was not the urge to hunt that drove him forward. It was something infinitely more dangerous and more powerful. Recognition. 800 years of searching, of believing himself cursed to eternal solitude, and she had been sitting 12 tables away. His destined mate, marked by the universe itself as his other half, his completion, his salvation. The ancient laws his kind lived by were as immutable as the pull of the moon on the tides, and one law stood above all others. When a vampire encountered their true mate, when the bond sparked to life in response to their beloved's need, nothing else mattered. Not politics, not secrecy, not the careful balance of power he had spent centuries maintaining. She needed protection, and he would provide it. She had been wounded, and he would heal her. She had been rejected, and he would claim her. The vampire king crossed the restaurant floor with fluid grace, each step bringing him closer to his destiny and further from the life he had known. His kind did not believe in coincidence, and he understood now that every choice he had made, every path he had walked for 8 centuries, had led him to this moment. To her. To the shy librarian with amber eyes who sat frozen in the wreckage of her ruined evening, completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. The ancient blood that flowed through his veins sang with recognition as he approached her table, and somewhere in the deepest part of his immortal soul, Lucien Dracul felt something he had thought lost forever. Hope. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The cool evening air carried the scent of rain as Lucien guided Sophia through the restaurant's revolving door, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back with a protective gesture that felt both foreign and natural. She had accepted his offer to escort her home with the bewildered gratitude of someone still processing the evening's surreal turn, her mind struggling to reconcile the elegant stranger's unexpected kindness with Marcus's brutal rejection. The sidewalk stretched before them, illuminated by streetlights that cast long shadows between the parked cars, and Sophia found herself stealing glances at her mysterious companion as they walked. There was something otherworldly about him that went beyond his striking appearance. Something in the way he moved with predatory grace and the manner in which his dark eyes seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. She had noticed how the restaurant staff had treated him with a deference that bordered on reverence, how conversations had quieted when he passed their tables, as if his presence commanded a respect she could not understand. His voice, when he spoke, carried traces of an accent she could not place, something old and refined that suggested education and breeding far beyond her own modest background. They had walked 3 blocks in comfortable silence when the sound of running footsteps echoed behind them, accompanied by the aggressive shouts of someone who had clearly spent the intervening time building liquid courage. Marcus appeared under the streetlight ahead, swaying slightly as he blocked their path, his expensive suit wrinkled and his tie askew. His face was flushed with alcohol and anger, his eyes bright with the dangerous combination of wounded pride and Dutch courage that turned reasonable men into something uglier. He had clearly been drinking since leaving the restaurant, probably at one of the upscale bars that catered to men like him, men who believed their wealth entitled them to whatever they wanted. Sophia felt Lucian stiffen beside her, his casual demeanor shifting into something alert and dangerous, like a predator scenting threat in the air. Marcus pointed an unsteady finger at Lucian, his voice slurred but venomous as he demanded to know who this stranger thought he was, swooping in like some kind of hero to rescue his reject of a date. The words tumbled out in an increasingly aggressive stream, accusations about interference and suggestions about Lucian's motivations that made Sophia's cheeks burn with fresh humiliation. She tried to step backward, to remove herself from the confrontation, but Marcus grabbed her arm with fingers that dug into her flesh hard enough to leave marks. His grip was punishing, designed to hurt, and she gasped at the sudden pain that shot up her arm like fire. The sound she made, that small cry of distress, seemed to flip a switch in the man beside her. Lucian had been standing perfectly still, his face a mask of controlled politeness. But the moment Marcus's fingers closed around Sophia's arm, with violent intent, something fundamental shifted. The temperature around them seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant, and the shadows between the streetlights deepened as if responding to his presence. When Lucian spoke, his voice carried an authority that seemed to resonate in the bones, a tone that suggested consequences far beyond anything Marcus could imagine. "Release her," he said, and the words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of power that Sophia could feel even though she did not understand them. His eyes, which had been dark brown in the restaurant, now gleamed with silver light that seemed to come from within, reflecting the streetlights in a way that human eyes simply should not. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor, and tightened his grip on Sophia's arm until she whimpered. That was his mistake. Lucian's careful control, maintained through 8 centuries of discipline and restraint, snapped like an overstressed cable. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be, particularly the canines that caught the light with predatory gleam. When he stepped forward, Marcus stumbled backward, but did not release Sophia, his alcohol-fueled bravado warring with a sudden, primal fear that his rational mind could not explain. The Vampire King did not touch him. He did not need to. Instead, he spoke in that voice of absolute command, weaving compulsion through his words like a master craftsman working precious metal. "Every cruel word you spoke to her tonight," Lucian said with deadly quiet, "will return to you tenfold. You will feel the pain you caused, the humiliation you inflicted, the worthlessness you tried to make her believe about herself." Marcus's face went white, then gray, as supernatural power crashed over him like a tidal wave. The compulsion wrapped around his mind with inexorable force, taking every insult he had hurled at Sophia and transforming it into physical agony that started in his chest and spread outward like poison through his veins. He released her arm and clutched at his heart, gasping as the emotional devastation he had inflicted was returned to him magnified and refined. The worthlessness he had tried to make her feel became a crushing weight that drove him to his knees on the concrete, and the ugliness he had accused her of possessing became a mirror that showed him his own twisted soul. He collapsed completely, curling into himself on the sidewalk like a child, tears streaming down his face as he begged for mercy from torments he could not understand. Lucian watched with the dispassionate interest of a scientist, observing the results of an experiment, then turned away as if Marcus no longer existed. The broken man scrambled to his feet and fled into the darkness, his footsteps echoing off the buildings as he ran from something that defied every rational explanation his mind could provide. Sophia stood frozen, her arms still aching where Marcus had grabbed her, but her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. She had seen Lucian's eyes change, color, had heard the inhuman authority in his voice, had watched a grown man collapse in agony from words alone. Logic insisted that what she had observed was impossible, that stress and shock were making her imagine things that could not be real. But her instincts, honed by years of reading about worlds beyond the mundane, whispered that she had just glimpsed something far older and more dangerous than anything in her carefully ordered life. When she looked at Lucian, expecting to find the same mysterious gentleman who had rescued her from humiliation, she found instead a stranger wearing his face. The warmth had drained from his expression, replaced by something distant and ancient that made her take an involuntary step backward. He seemed to realize what had happened, what he had revealed, and the careful mask of humanity settled back over his features like a curtain being drawn. His voice, when he spoke again, was formal and remote, as if the intimate conversation they had shared over dinner had never happened. He offered to escort her home with the polite detachment of a stranger fulfilling an unpleasant obligation, and she found herself nodding numbly, her mind too overwhelmed to form coherent objections. They walked the remaining 6 blocks in absolute silence, the easy companionship of earlier replaced by a tension that seemed to thicken with every step. Sophia wanted to ask him what had happened, how he had reduced Marcus to a sobbing wreck without laying a finger on him, but the set of his shoulders and the rigid line of his jaw suggested that questions would not be welcome. At her apartment building, he waited while she fumbled with her keys, his presence both protective and somehow ominous in the dim glow of the security lights. She turned to thank him, to try to bridge the sudden distance between them, but found only empty sidewalk where he had been standing. No footsteps, no sound of departure, just the night air and the distant hum of traffic from the main street. Inside her small apartment, Sophia deadbolted the door and leaned against it, her heart racing with delayed shock and confusion. She examined the bruises on her arm where Marcus had grabbed her, 5 distinct finger-shaped marks that were already darkening to purple. The pain was real enough, proof that the entire evening had not been some elaborate dream. But the memory of Lucian's silver eyes and impossible voice seemed to fade even as she tried to hold on to the details. She made chamomile tea with shaking hands and sat at her kitchen table, trying to write down everything that had happened before the rational part of her mind could dismiss it as stress-induced fantasy. By the time she finished her account, dawn was painting the eastern sky pale gold, and exhaustion was pulling at her consciousness like lead weights. She fell asleep on the couch, still wearing her navy dress, and woke 3 hours later to the sound of her phone buzzing with a text from Jessica asking how the date had gone. The sight of her friend's cheerful message brought the previous night flooding back with painful clarity, and she spent several minutes staring at the screen before typing a simple response that the evening had not worked out as planned. It was only when she was getting ready to leave for work that she noticed the small package sitting outside her door, wrapped in black velvet that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Inside was an antique silver pendant on a delicate chain, the metal worked into an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and change as she looked at it. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master artisan, and the silver felt warm against her skin despite having sat outside in the cool morning air. Tucked beneath the pendant was a card made of heavy cream paper, and written in elegant script that looked as if it had been done with an actual fountain pen were 4 simple words that made her pulse quicken with equal parts fear and anticipation. "For your protection," it said, and nothing more. She held the pendant up to the light, watching the way the silver seemed to move with its own internal radiance, and felt the first stirrings of a truth she was not yet ready to acknowledge. Whatever Lucian was, whatever power he wielded, he was not finished with her. The pendant was not just a gift, but a promise, a declaration that their story had only just begun. She fastened the chain around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her skin like a secret, and knew with absolute certainty that her quiet life of books and solitude had ended forever. The Vampire King had claimed her as his own, and whether she understood it or not, she now belonged to a world where impossible things walked in shadows and ancient powers stirred at the call of destiny. The downtown library stood silent in the pale glow of security lights, its Gothic architecture casting long shadows across the empty street as Sophia finished her closing routine 3 weeks after the night that had changed everything. She had thrown herself into work with desperate intensity, cataloging returns and processing new acquisitions with the methodical precision of someone trying to lose herself in familiar tasks. The silver pendant hung beneath her blouse, its weight a constant reminder of mysteries she could not solve, and questions that multiplied faster than she could find answers. Every morning she woke expecting the previous weeks to reveal themselves as an elaborate dream, but the bruises on her arm had faded to yellow and green before disappearing entirely, leaving her with nothing but the pendant and a growing certainty that her life had been fundamentally altered by forces beyond her comprehension. She had researched everything she could find about the strange encounter, spending her lunch breaks diving deep into folklore and mythology, searching for explanations that made sense of what she had witnessed. The library's collection on supernatural legends was surprisingly extensive, filled with accounts of creatures that walked the boundary between human and something else, and she found herself drawn particularly to stories of vampires and their supposed abilities. The descriptions of inhuman strength, supernatural authority, and eyes that reflected light in impossible ways matched her memories with disturbing accuracy, but every rational part of her mind rejected such fantastical explanations. She was locking the main entrance when she heard her name spoken in a voice she had been hoping and dreading to hear again. Lucian stood in the shadows beside the building, his dark coat making him nearly invisible against the brick wall, and she felt her pulse quicken with the same mixture of fear and attraction that had haunted her dreams since their encounter. He moved toward her with that fluid grace she remembered, each step deliberate and controlled, and she noticed again how the darkness seemed to bend around him as if responding to his presence. His pale skin seemed to glow in the streetlight, and his dark eyes held depths that suggested secrets accumulated over lifetimes rather than mere years. He apologized for startling her, his voice carrying the same formal courtesy that had marked their first meeting, but there was an urgency beneath his polite words that had not been there before. She found herself backing against the library door, her keys still clutched in her hand, as he approached with the careful movements of someone approaching a frightened animal. There were things he needed to tell her, he said, truths that she deserved to know even though sharing them would put them both in greater danger than she could imagine. The pendant she wore was more than simple jewelry, and the connection between them was governed by laws older than human civilization, laws that demanded acknowledgement even at the cost of everything he had spent centuries building. Sophia felt her rational mind warring with instincts that recognized truth in his words, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than she had expected. She told him she had been researching, trying to understand what had happened that night, and that she suspected he was not entirely human, despite every logical objection her mind could raise. Something shifted in his expression at her words, a mixture of relief and regret that suggested he had been hoping she would figure it out on her own, while simultaneously dreading the moment when pretense became impossible. He extended his hand toward her, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand, and after a moment of hesitation, she placed her fingers against his skin. The cold shocked her, flesh that felt like marble despite the warmth of the evening, and she realized she could detect no pulse beneath the pale surface. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of confession, and he told her truths that shattered her understanding of the world as completely as Marcus's cruelty had shattered her self-confidence. He was vampire, he said, a creature that had once been human but now existed in the spaces between life and death. Sustained by blood and bound by laws that governed the supernatural world she had never known existed. He had lived for 8 centuries, ruling over others of his kind, maintaining the delicate balance that kept their species hidden from human awareness and human society, safe from the predators that walked among them without detection. The night they met, something ancient and irrevocable had awakened within him, a mating bond that his kind experienced perhaps once in a millennium, a connection that transcended physical attraction or emotional compatibility to touch something fundamental in the supernatural essence that defined what they were. She was his destined mate, chosen not by conscious decision, but by forces older than memory. And from the moment he had witnessed her pain, his fate had become irrevocably entwined with hers, whether either of them wished it or not. Sophia listened to his explanation with growing wonder and terror, her logical mind screaming that such things were impossible, even as her heart recognized truth in every word he spoke. She had felt the connection too, she realized, the inexplicable sense that meeting him had changed something essential about who she was, the way her dreams had been filled with images of castles and corridors that felt more like memories than fantasies. When she asked him to prove what he claimed, he stepped backward into the shadows cast by the building's overhang and seemed to merge with the darkness itself, becoming part of the night in a way that defied every law of physics she thought she understood. He reappeared behind her without a sound, moving faster than human vision could track. And when she spun to face him, his eyes reflected the streetlight with silver radiance that transformed his face into something beautiful and terrifying. He lifted a wrought iron fence post from the library's garden border, metal that should have required tools to remove, and bent it into impossible shapes with casual strength that demonstrated power beyond anything in her experience. The display should have sent her running, but instead she found herself stepping closer, drawn by fascination stronger than fear. She reached toward his face with trembling fingers, touching skin that felt real despite its supernatural temperature, and felt something electric pass between them at the contact. The sensation started as warmth beneath her fingers, but spread through her entire body like liquid fire, awakening sensations she had never experienced and abilities she had never possessed. Suddenly she could sense his emotions with startling clarity, could feel the centuries of loneliness that had shaped him and the desperate hope her presence had kindled in his immortal heart. The pendant around her neck grew warm against her skin, responding to the supernatural energy that flowed between them, and she understood instinctively that it was protecting her from detection by others of his kind, while amplifying the connection they shared. When their lips finally met, the world exploded into sensation that transcended the merely physical, and she felt her consciousness expand to touch something vast and ancient that resided within him. Images flashed through her mind of castles perched on impossible cliffs, of courts where creatures of legend held sway over domains that existed parallel to the human world she had known all her life. She saw glimpses of his past, fragments of the lonely centuries he had endured, waiting for something he had begun to believe would never come. The kiss awakened dormant abilities within her that she had never suspected she possessed. Supernatural senses that allowed her to perceive the world as he did, to detect the emotional currents that flowed through all living things, and to sense the presence of creatures that existed beyond normal human awareness. She could feel his hunger, not the simple need for blood that folklore suggested, but something deeper and more complex, a craving for connection that had gone unfulfilled for longer than most civilizations had existed. When they finally separated, she found herself fundamentally changed, no longer entirely human, but something new and unprecedented, a bridge between worlds that had remained separate since time immemorial. He warned her that knowledge came with consequences, that there were others of his kind who would see their bond as a threat to the careful secrecy their species had maintained for millennia. Ancient laws governed vampire society with ruthless efficiency, and chief among those laws was the prohibition against emotional attachments that might compromise their supernatural objectivity or expose their existence to human scrutiny. By claiming her as his mate, he had violated codes that his own council had established, and the penalty for such transgression was exile or death, depending on the whims of beings older and more powerful than anything she could imagine. He should leave her, he said, should disappear from her life and allow her memories to fade until their encounter became nothing more than a strange dream that would trouble her sleep occasionally but pose no threat to either of their worlds. But the bond between them was stronger than wisdom or self-preservation, and he found himself unable to walk away from the one person who had ever seen him as more than a monster wearing the face of a man. Sophia listened to his warnings with growing determination rather than fear, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried strength that surprised them both. She told him she would not be abandoned again, would not allow fear to rob her of the first connection that had ever made her feel truly alive. If their bond was real, if the supernatural world he described was governed by laws as immutable as those that ruled human society, then those laws could be challenged and changed by people willing to fight for something better. She had spent her entire life accepting what others decided she deserved, allowing herself to be diminished by their limited vision of her worth. But meeting him had awakened something fierce and uncompromising within her that refused to surrender without a battle. 3 blocks away, in a penthouse that overlooked the city, with windows tinted to block the dawn, Viktor Volkov stood before a massive oak table where 5 figures in expensive suits discussed matters that would determine the fate of supernatural society. The Vampire Council had convened an emergency session, summoned by reports that their king had been seen in the company of a human woman displaying protective behavior that suggested the formation of a mating bond. Such attachments had been forbidden since the Great Revelation nearly triggered exposure 3 centuries ago, when a vampire lord's human lover had been used against him by enemies who understood that emotional connections created vulnerabilities their species could not afford. Victor had served as Lucian's second-in-command for over 4 centuries, had helped him build the complex political structure that kept their kind hidden and their territories secure, and he understood better than most what would happen if the council decided their king had become a liability to vampire survival. The evidence was overwhelming and damning: witness reports from the restaurant incident, security footage that showed Lucian's supernatural abilities being used in defense of a human woman, and most convincingly, the shift in his behavior that suggested he was no longer capable of making decisions based purely on the needs of vampire society. The council's leader, a creature so ancient that his true name had been forgotten by history, spoke with the patient authority of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall while their kind endured in the shadows. The law was clear and unambiguous, and sentiment could not be allowed to override wisdom accumulated through millennia of careful survival. Lucian would be given 48 hours to renounce the bond and submit to having the human's memories erased, or he would face the consequences reserved for those who threatened their species' continued existence. Victor accepted the council's ultimatum with the heavy heart of someone who understood that loyalty sometimes demanded terrible choices, and he prepared to deliver news that would force his oldest friend to choose between love and everything they had built together. In the weeks following the council's ultimatum, shadows began to gather around Sophia's life like storm clouds on a distant horizon, and she found herself noticing things that would have escaped her attention before her supernatural awakening. The same pale man appeared at 3 different coffee shops she visited, always seated 2 tables away, with a newspaper he never seemed to read. A woman with silver hair lingered outside her apartment building for hours at a time, pretending to wait for someone who never came. Cars with tinted windows followed her route to work with mechanical precision, always maintaining the same distance, always disappearing just before she could get a clear look at the license plates. The pendant Lucian had given her grew warm against her skin whenever these watchers drew too close, its protective magic responding to threats she was only beginning to understand. She had learned to trust its warnings, to alter her path when the silver heated against her throat, but she could not shake the feeling that something larger and more dangerous than simple surveillance was closing around them like a net designed to trap creatures far more powerful than herself. Marcus Chen sat in a psychiatric facility 3 states away. His mind fractured by an encounter with supernatural forces his rational mind could not process, but his obsession with the woman who had destroyed his carefully ordered life had only grown stronger during his confinement. The doctors spoke of trauma-induced paranoia and prescribed medications that dulled the sharp edges of his memories without erasing them entirely. But Marcus knew with absolute certainty that what he had experienced was real. The man who had spoken with a voice like thunder and made him feel worthless with supernatural authority was no ordinary human. And the woman he had dismissed as plain and forgettable was somehow connected to powers that defied everything he thought he understood about the world. He spent his days in group therapy sessions, pretending to discuss his feelings and progress toward recovery while privately researching everything he could find about supernatural encounters and the creatures that allegedly walked among humanity undetected. The hospital's limited internet access frustrated his efforts, but he was patient and methodical, piecing together fragments of folklore and witness accounts that suggested vampires and other monsters were more than medieval superstition. When Elena Vasquez appeared at his bedside one evening after visiting hours, moving through the locked facility's security with impossible ease, he felt no surprise at her obvious inhumanity. She was beautiful in the way that predators were beautiful, all sharp edges and dangerous curves, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the sterile fluorescent light and eyes that reflected the darkness between them with silver fire. She spoke to him about revenge and justice, about the vampire king who had humiliated him and the human woman who had somehow bewitched one of the most powerful creatures in supernatural society. Elena had been watching Lucian for decades, waiting for him to show weakness that could be exploited, and his sudden attachment to a mortal librarian represented the opportunity she had been seeking to claim the throne she believed was rightfully hers. She needed allies who understood the threat Sophia represented, and who had personal motivation to see her removed from the equation, and Marcus's damaged psyche made him perfect for manipulation. She offered him the chance to reclaim his dignity and prove that the encounter in the alley had not broken him as completely as the doctors believed. And in exchange, she would provide him with resources and allies capable of destroying the creatures who had ruined his life. Marcus accepted her proposal with the fervor of someone who had found purpose in madness, and together they began planning a campaign that would draw Lucian into the open, where older and more experienced predators could finish what Elena had started. Their first recruit was Tobias Reed, a professional monster hunter who had been tracking vampire movements across 3 continents for the better part of 2 decades. Tobias operated from the shadows of human society, funded by old money families who had lost members to supernatural predators and government agencies that officially denied the existence of creatures their black-budget programs were designed to eliminate. He was methodical and patient, a scholar of vampire weaknesses and ancient magic who understood that hunting immortal predators required knowledge as much as courage. His workshop was filled with weapons forged from silver, blessed by priests from a dozen different faiths, crossbow bolts carved with symbols that could disrupt supernatural healing, and vials of holy water collected from sacred sites around the world. More importantly, he possessed detailed files on vampire nobility, including surveillance photographs and behavioral assessments that had cost several good agents their lives to acquire. Elena's offer of information about Lucian's current location and emotional vulnerabilities was too valuable to refuse, even if it meant working with one of the creatures he had dedicated his life to destroying. Tobias understood that vampire politics could be used against them, that their rigid hierarchical structure created opportunities for exploitation by humans clever enough to turn their laws and customs into weapons. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity, designed to force Lucian into positions where he would have to choose between protecting his human mate and maintaining the careful relationships that kept vampire society stable. Phase 1 involved placing a tracking spell on Sophia that would allow them to monitor her movements, while simultaneously broadcasting her location to every supernatural predator in the city. The spell was woven into a coffee cup lid at her favorite cafe, activated by her touch and designed to integrate with her natural magical abilities in ways that would make detection almost impossible. Tobias accomplished this with the casual efficiency of someone who had placed similar spells on dozens of targets, appearing as nothing more than a middle-aged businessman enjoying his morning coffee while she waited in line 3 customers ahead of him. The magic settled into her aura like a parasite, feeding on the supernatural energy that flowed between her and Lucian, while simultaneously amplifying her presence to every creature within a 50-mile radius that possessed the senses to detect it. The pendant she wore provided some protection, but the spell was specifically designed to work around such defensive measures, using her own awakening abilities as a conduit to bypass magical shields. Lucian sensed the intrusion within hours of its activation, recognizing the subtle wrongness in their connection with the instincts of someone who had survived 8 centuries by paying attention to details others might miss. The mating bond that linked them had been contaminated by foreign magic, twisted into something that could be used against them both, and he understood immediately that they were dealing with enemies who possessed supernatural knowledge and resources. He called in favors accumulated over centuries of careful relationship building, reaching out to werewolf packs who owed him territory, disputes resolved in their favor, and witch covens who remembered his intervention during the supernatural tribunals of the 18th century. The supernatural community existed in a delicate balance of mutual dependence and barely contained hostility, with treaties and agreements that stretched back generations, serving as the only thing preventing open warfare between species that had vastly different ideas about humanity's place in the natural order. Catherine Blackwood answered his call within hours, appearing at Sophia's apartment with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been expecting trouble for quite some time. The witch was ancient even by supernatural standards, her apparent age of 40 concealing nearly 6 centuries of accumulated wisdom and magical expertise. She had served as advisor to vampire courts and werewolf councils, mediating disputes between species and maintaining the complex web of alliances that kept their hidden world stable. Her presence in Sophia's living room transformed the mundane space into something charged with power, and even the air seemed to shimmer with possibilities that had nothing to do with physics or chemistry. Catherine examined the tracking spell with the clinical detachment of a surgeon studying a particularly interesting tumor, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that made reality ripple like disturbed water. The magic was sophisticated and dangerous, she explained, designed not just to monitor Sophia's location, but to slowly corrupt her developing abilities until they became weapons that could be turned against Lucian. Worse, The spell was feeding information to someone who understood vampire mating bonds well enough to exploit their fundamental nature, suggesting enemies with access to knowledge that should have been lost centuries ago. The witch revealed that vampire-human bonds were rare, but not unprecedented, occurring perhaps once every few centuries when the supernatural alignment was precisely correct and both parties possessed the spiritual resonance necessary for such connections to form. History recorded fewer than a dozen successful bonds, and most of those had ended in tragedy when political pressures or supernatural enemies discovered how to use the connection against its participants. However, the bonds that survived produced some of the most powerful couples in supernatural history, combinations of vampire immortality and human adaptability that could reshape the balance of power between species. Sophia possessed latent magical abilities that had been awakened by her connection to Lucian, Catherine explained, gifts that would normally take decades of training to develop, but were being accelerated by the supernatural energy flowing through the mating bond. With proper instruction, she could learn to shield her thoughts from psychic intrusion, to sense the emotional auras of supernatural beings, and to channel protective magic through the pendant that would make her nearly invisible to hostile detection. The training would be dangerous and exhausting, requiring her to push beyond human limitations while maintaining enough humanity to serve as an anchor for Lucian's darker impulses, but it was their only hope of surviving the forces that were gathering against them. Over the following weeks, Sophia threw herself into magical education with the desperate intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was the only weapon she possessed against enemies who had been planning her destruction for longer than she had been alive. Catherine taught her to visualize magical energy as flowing water that could be directed and shaped through will and intention, showing her how to weave protective barriers around her thoughts and how to extend those barriers to include the people she cared about. The pendant became a focus for her developing abilities, its silver surface warming in response to her concentration until she could channel enough power through it to disrupt electronic surveillance and confuse the supernatural senses that were tracking her movements. Lucian shared his own knowledge during evening sessions that felt more like graduate courses in supernatural politics than romantic encounters, explaining the complex hierarchies and ancient grudges that shaped vampire society. She learned about the Great War between vampires and werewolves that had raged for 3 centuries before ending in an uneasy truce, about the witch trials that had actually been cover operations designed to eliminate supernatural threats to vampire territory, and about the delicate network of human allies who helped maintain the masquerade that kept both species hidden from general awareness. Most importantly, she began to understand the weight of responsibility that came with being connected to someone who held the fate of thousands of supernatural beings in his ancient hands. Their bond deepened through shared training and mutual vulnerability, each revelation about his world drawing them closer together even as it highlighted the impossibility of their situation. The council's deadline approached like an executioner's schedule, counting down the hours until Lucian would be forced to choose between love and everything he had built over 8 centuries of careful leadership. The choice was made for him when the council sent assassins to test his resolve, 3 vampires loyal to Elena who attacked during one of their training sessions with Catherine. Lucian destroyed them with ruthless efficiency, his ancient power overwhelming their coordinated assault in a display of violence that left Sophia shaken but also oddly reassured about his ability to protect her. By defending her against council operatives, he had officially declared himself a renegade, placing both of them beyond the protection of vampire law and marking them as legitimate targets for anyone with the courage and ability to claim the bounty that Elena would undoubtedly place on their heads. The final escalation came when Elena kidnapped Maria, Sophia's younger sister, taking her from the graduate program where she was studying art history and leaving behind only a message written in elegant script on expensive paper. The terms were simple and non-negotiable: submit to memory erasure and return to his duties as vampire king, or watch innocent humans suffer the consequences of his selfishness. The game had moved beyond supernatural politics into something far more personal and dangerous, and Sophia understood with crystal clarity that their enemies were prepared to destroy anyone and anything to achieve their goals. The abandoned Cathedral of St. Bartholomew stood like a broken tooth against the midnight sky, its Gothic spires reaching towards stars that seemed dimmer than usual, as if the approaching confrontation had drawn shadows from the very heavens themselves. Sophia stood beside Lucian's black sedan, her hands trembling despite the warmth of the late spring evening, staring up at the edifice that would serve as the stage for what might be their final moments together. The cathedral had been desecrated decades ago when the archdiocese sold it to developers who never followed through on their renovation plans, leaving it to decay in the industrial district where homeless camps and drug dealers had claimed the surrounding blocks as their territory. For supernatural beings, it represented neutral ground, a place where ancient laws prohibited violence between rival factions and where disputes could be resolved through negotiation rather than bloodshed. Elena had chosen it precisely because vampire tradition would prevent Lucian from using his full power within its walls, and the irony was not lost on any of them that a place once dedicated to divine protection would become the setting for such unholy machinations. Catherine had spent 3 days trying to divine Elena's true intentions through scrying spells and tarot readings, but the vampire's mind was shielded by magic older and more sophisticated than anything the witch had encountered in recent centuries. Victor had provided intelligence about Elena's growing alliance with council dissidents, but even he seemed uncertain about the exact scope of the conspiracy they were walking into. The only thing they knew for certain was that Maria was being held somewhere within the cathedral's labyrinthine basement, probably in the old crypts where the city's wealthy families had once entombed their dead in ornate sarcophagi that now served as hiding places for creatures far more dangerous than mere corpses. Sophia had insisted on making the exchange despite Lucian's protests, despite Catherine's warnings about the obvious trap they were walking into, despite Victor's assessment that Elena would never honor any agreement that left Lucian alive and free to reclaim his throne. Her sister was innocent of any involvement in supernatural politics, a 24-year-old graduate student whose only crime had been sharing DNA with someone who had inadvertently become a pawn in a game older than most nations. The responsibility for Maria's safety rested squarely on Sophia's shoulders, and no amount of strategic thinking could override the fundamental truth that family came before everything else, even love, even survival, even the fate of the supernatural world that hung in the balance of their choices. Lucian walked beside her with the measured pace of someone approaching his own execution, his dark coat billowing in the wind that seemed to carry whispers of ancient power and approaching doom. He had tried everything he could think of to dissuade her from this course of action, had offered to trade himself for Maria's freedom, had suggested elaborate rescue plans that involved calling in favors from every supernatural ally he had cultivated over 8 centuries of careful relationship building. But Sophia had remained adamant that she would not allow her sister to suffer for choices she had made, would not permit innocent blood to be spilled, because she had fallen in love with a creature whose very existence defied every natural law she had once believed governed the universe. The pendant around her neck had grown cold against her skin as they approached the cathedral, its protective magic responding to the malevolent forces that had gathered within the sacred walls like antibodies detecting an infection. She could sense them through the supernatural awareness that her bond with Lucian had awakened, could feel the hatred and hunger radiating from creatures that had spent decades or centuries planning this moment. Elena's presence burned like acid against her consciousness, a mixture of jealousy and ambition that had festered for so long it had become its own form of madness. More disturbing were the human mind she detected, thoughts twisted by exposure to supernatural compulsion until their owners were no longer entirely sane, driven by obsessions that had consumed whatever humanity they had once possessed. The cathedral's massive oak doors stood ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold, and Sophia understood that crossing that boundary would commit them to a path that would end in either triumph or destruction, with no possibility of retreat. Elena materialized from the shadows just inside the entrance, her pale beauty made terrible by the smile that revealed fangs sharpened to needle points and eyes that reflected the moonlight with predatory gleam. She wore a black dress that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and her hair fell around her shoulders like liquid shadow, creating an aura of darkness that made the already dim interior seem even more ominous. Behind her stood three other figures, vampires whose ages and power Sophia could sense even through her limited supernatural awareness, creatures who had allied themselves with Elena's cause for reasons that probably had more to do with political opportunism than genuine loyalty. The Vampire Council had promised Elena the throne in exchange for eliminating what they called the human problem. She explained with the satisfaction of someone revealing a particularly clever strategy. Lucian's attachment to immortal had made him vulnerable in ways that his enemies could exploit, and his refusal to renounce their bond had proven that he was no longer capable of making decisions based purely on what was best for vampire society. The council had never intended to honor their ultimatum because they understood that a king who would choose love over duty was a king who could no longer be trusted with the survival of their species. Maria sat bound to a chair near the altar, her eyes wide with terror, but her mouth sealed by some supernatural compulsion that prevented her from crying out or calling for help. She looked exactly as Sophia remembered from their last family dinner, young and vibrant and completely unprepared for the nightmare she had been dragged into through no fault of her own. The sight of her sister's fear cut through Sophia's heart like a blade, and she stepped forward with the intention of demanding her immediate release. But Elena raised one elegant hand in a gesture that carried enough supernatural authority to freeze Sophia in place despite her growing magical abilities. The exchange would proceed according to Elena's terms, she explained, with Sophia taking her sister's place as bait to draw Lucian into a position where he could be destroyed, along with the human who had corrupted his judgment. Victor emerged from the shadows near the transept, his familiar face transformed by an expression Sophia had never seen before, cold calculation mixed with something that might have been regret. He had been planning this coup for over 2 centuries, he revealed, waiting for Lucian to show weakness that could be exploited by vampires who understood that emotional attachments made their kind vulnerable to manipulation and destruction. The council had grown tired of Lucian's increasingly progressive policies, his efforts to establish better relationships with werewolf packs and witch covens, his reluctance to expand vampire territory at the expense of human populations that had no idea they were being hunted. Victor represented the old guard, vampires who believed their species should embrace their predatory nature rather than trying to coexist peacefully with inferior creatures. And Elena's conspiracy had provided him with the perfect opportunity to remove a king whose compassion had become a liability to vampire supremacy. As he spoke, Sophia became aware of additional figures moving in the cathedral's deeper shadows. Humans whose scents carried the metallic tang of weapons designed specifically for killing supernatural creatures. Tobias Reed stepped into the moonlight that streamed through the cathedral's broken stained glass windows, his weathered face set in lines of grim satisfaction as he revealed the true scope of the trap they had walked into. The entire cathedral was surrounded by wards powered by innocent blood, magical barriers that would prevent any vampire from using their supernatural abilities to escape or fight back effectively. He had spent weeks preparing the ritual circles carved into the stone floor, inscribing symbols that would drain power from any immortal creature within their boundaries, while simultaneously broadcasting their location to every supernatural hunter within 100 miles. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, Elena would eliminate Lucien and claim his throne, while Tobias would capture or destroy one of the most powerful vampires in existence, proving that even vampire royalty could be brought down by humans with sufficient knowledge and preparation. Marcus stepped out from behind one of the massive stone pillars, his once handsome face transformed by weeks of psychiatric medication and supernatural trauma into something gaunt and desperate. His eyes held the fevered brightness of someone whose grip on reality had been permanently damaged by exposure to powers beyond human comprehension. And when he looked at Sophia, his expression carried hatred so pure it seemed to burn the air between them. He blamed her for everything that had happened to him, for the madness that had cost him his job and his social standing, for the nightmares that plagued his sleep, and the constant paranoia that made normal human relationships impossible. Elena had promised him the chance to reclaim his dignity by destroying the woman who had somehow bewitched one of the most powerful predators in supernatural society. And he approached Sophia with a silver knife that Tobias had blessed with holy water and inscribed with symbols designed to cause maximum pain to any creature touched by supernatural power. The pendant around Sophia's neck began to vibrate with increasing intensity as Marcus drew closer, its protective magic responding to the immediate threat with power that made her skin tingle and her vision blur around the edges. She could feel Lucian's rage building like a storm on the horizon, could sense his supernatural strength straining against the magical barriers that Tobias had erected around the cathedral. But the wards were holding, containing his power and preventing him from protecting her as he had during their first encounter. When Marcus lunged forward with the enchanted blade, Sophia's newly awakened abilities responded without conscious direction, creating a barrier of pure force that sent him flying backward into one of the stone columns with enough impact to crack both the pillar and several of his ribs. The effort left her drained and gasping, but it also proved to everyone present that her supernatural abilities were real and growing stronger, that she was no longer the helpless human who had been humiliated in an upscale restaurant weeks earlier. The demonstration of power was too much for the pendant's delicate structure, and the ancient silver shattered against her throat, releasing all the protective magic it had contained in a burst of white light that temporarily blinded every creature in the cathedral and disrupted the carefully constructed ward network that Tobias had spent weeks establishing. In the moments of chaos that followed, Lucian's true power emerged like a dam bursting after centuries of careful control. 800 years of accumulated strength and rage flowing through him with the force of a supernatural hurricane. His eyes blazed with silver fire that seemed to burn away the shadows themselves. And when he moved, it was with speed that made him appear to teleport rather than run. Elena met him in combat with the desperate ferocity of someone who understood that failure meant not just death, but eternal damnation, her own considerable abilities enhanced by dark magic that she had been accumulating for decades in preparation for this confrontation. They fought among the cathedral's ancient columns with superhuman grace and violence, their battle destroying centuries-old stone carvings and sending shockwaves through the building's foundation that made the entire structure groan in protest. Sophia used her freed magical abilities to create protective barriers around Maria, shielding her terrified sister from the supernatural forces that threatened to tear the cathedral apart around them. The Vampire Council arrived in force just as Catherine and her witch allies breached the outer defenses, turning what had been a carefully planned ambush into a three-way battle that threatened to expose the supernatural world to human attention on a scale that would make secrecy impossible to maintain. Ancient vampires who had survived the fall of empires faced off against modern hunters armed with technology and magic, while witches who remembered the burning times called down power that made the very air crackle with barely contained lightning. In the center of the chaos, Sophia made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself, offering to undergo vampire transformation as proof of her commitment to Lucian's world and her willingness to accept the responsibilities that came with immortality. Lucian refused even as he fought for their lives, insisting that such a decision could not be made in desperation, that she deserved to understand fully what she would be giving up and what she would become. The battle raged on around them as Victor revealed the true scope of his conspiracy, as Elena's allies turned on each other when victory seemed impossible, as forces that had been building for centuries finally collided in a conflict that would reshape the supernatural world regardless of who emerged victorious. The cathedral fell silent, as if the very stones had absorbed the violence that had raged within its walls, and from the smoke and debris that marked the end of the supernatural battle, a figure emerged who commanded instant respect from every creature present, regardless of their allegiance or species. Aldrich Montclair had ruled the Vampire Council for over 15 centuries, his apparent age of 30 concealing wisdom accumulated through the rise and fall of empires, and his presence carried weight that made even the most rebellious vampires bow their heads in acknowledgement of authority that predated most human civilizations. He wore simple black clothing that somehow managed to convey more power than Elena's elaborate dress or Victor's military bearing. And when he spoke, his voice carried the patient authority of someone who had arbitrated disputes between gods and monsters since before the collapse of Rome. The battle was over, he announced with quiet finality, and now it was time to address the underlying issues that had brought them to this point of near catastrophe. Elena knelt among the ruins of her conspiracy, her beauty marred by wounds that would take days to heal even with vampire regenerative abilities, while Victor stood with the rigid posture of a soldier accepting responsibility for a failed campaign. Marcus had been removed from the cathedral by paramedics who would later file reports about a gas leak explosion that had somehow left only one human casualty, their memories carefully edited by vampire compulsion to exclude any details that might expose supernatural involvement. Tobias Reed lay unconscious but alive, his extensive knowledge of vampire weaknesses making him too valuable to kill, despite the threat he represented to their continued secrecy. Catherine gathered her scattered witch allies, their combined magical abilities having been crucial in preventing the conflict from spilling into the human world where it would have triggered the very exposure they had all been trying to avoid. In the center of this supernatural tribunal, Sophia stood beside Lucian, with Maria's trembling form pressed against her side, her sister's mind already being gently cleansed of traumatic memories that would have driven her to madness if allowed to remain intact. The pendant's destruction had left Sophia temporarily defenseless against the full force of supernatural awareness, and she could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on her consciousness as ancient beings evaluated her worthiness to exist in their carefully ordered world. Aldrich regarded her with eyes that had seen the birth of nations and the death of species, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute law that could not be appealed or overturned by any earthly authority. The prohibition against vampire kings taking human mates was not arbitrary cruelty, he explained, but wisdom earned through catastrophic experience that had nearly destroyed their species multiple times throughout history. A mated vampire king became vulnerable to manipulation through his human partner, could be controlled or coerced by enemies who understood how to exploit emotional attachments that superseded rational judgment. More dangerously, the supernatural power that flowed through vampire nobility was fundamentally incompatible with the emotional instability that came with love, creating internal conflicts that could drive even the strongest minds to madness or worse. The last vampire king to take a human mate had been manipulated into declaring war against werewolf territories, resulting in decades of bloodshed that had exposed both species to human hunters and nearly led to total extinction before cooler heads could negotiate a truce that still governed supernatural politics in the modern era. Sophia listened to this recitation of ancient law and historical precedent with growing anger rather than intimidation. Her newly awakened magical abilities, responding to her emotional state, by creating small distortions in the air around her that made reality shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. When Aldrich finished his explanation, she stepped forward with the courage of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, her voice carrying conviction that surprised everyone present, including herself. She challenged the fundamental assumption underlying vampire law, pointing out that love had made Lucian stronger rather than weaker, that their bond had awakened abilities within her that could serve vampire society rather than threaten it. The historical examples Aldrich cited involved relationships built on dominance and possession rather than true partnership, she argued, connections that created dependency rather than mutual empowerment. Her relationship with Lucian was different because it was based on equality and respect, on the recognition that both partners brought unique strengths to their union rather than one serving as the weakness of the other. If vampire law was truly based on wisdom rather than prejudice, then it should be flexible enough to accommodate relationships that defied historical precedent, especially when those relationships might represent evolution rather than regression for their species. The council members exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication, and Sophia realized that she had touched on debates that had been raging in vampire society for centuries. Philosophical divisions between progressives who believed their kind could evolve beyond their predatory origins, and conservatives who insisted that survival required maintaining the brutal purity that had kept them hidden from human detection for millennia. Aldrich studied her with the intensity of someone evaluating a potentially dangerous but fascinating specimen, and when he finally responded, his words carried the weight of challenge rather than dismissal. If she truly believed that her bond with Lucian represented strength rather than weakness, then she would be willing to prove her worthiness through trials that had been designed to test the commitment and capabilities of those who sought to join vampire nobility. The Trial of Shadows was an ancient ritual that had not been invoked for over 3 centuries, a series of supernatural challenges that tested courage, wisdom, and sacrifice in ways that had broken the minds and souls of candidates far more prepared than a human librarian with barely awakened magical abilities. The trials were designed to strip away illusions and reveal the true character of those who faced them, to determine whether they possessed the strength of will necessary to bear the responsibilities that came with immortality and power. 3 challenges awaited her, each one more dangerous than the last, and failure would result not just in her death, but in the permanent severing of the mating bond that connected her to Lucian, leaving him free to resume his duties as vampire king, but forever marked by the loss of his chosen mate. Success would prove that their relationship was indeed different from those that had failed throughout history, that love could serve as a foundation for power rather than a weakness to be exploited by enemies. Sophia accepted the challenge without hesitation, understanding that this was likely her only chance to legitimize their bond in the eyes of vampire society and secure a future where they could be together without constant threat from political enemies who viewed their love as an existential threat to supernatural stability. The first trial manifested as a scene of urban chaos, where a group of human tourists had wandered into vampire territory during feeding time. Their innocent exploration of what they thought was an abandoned warehouse district transforming into a nightmare of predatory hunger and supernatural violence. Sophia found herself standing at the entrance to an alley where 3 vampires were systematically hunting 5 humans who had no understanding of what was happening to them or why their evening of adventure photography had become a desperate fight for survival. The trial's parameters were simple and brutal. She could save herself by walking away and allowing the humans to die, or she could attempt to protect them despite having no weapons, no training, and magical abilities that were still largely untested under real combat conditions. The vampires hunting the tourists were not random killers, but council operatives whose skills had been honed by centuries of experience, and they would show no mercy to anyone who interfered with their assigned task, regardless of her connection to vampire royalty. Sophia chose sacrifice without hesitation, throwing herself between the hunters and their prey with magic that burned through her consciousness like liquid fire as she struggled to maintain protective barriers around 5 terrified humans who could not understand why an invisible force was deflecting attacks from shadows that moved faster than human eyes could track. The effort of shielding multiple people simultaneously while under assault from supernatural predators pushed her abilities far beyond their current limits, and she felt her life force being drained away like water flowing through a broken dam as she fought to maintain defenses that were never meant to protect so many people at once. Blood ran from her nose and eyes as the magical backlash tore through her nervous system, and she collapsed to her knees while still maintaining the protective barriers that were the only thing standing between innocent lives and supernatural death. The humans escaped into the night, carrying memories that would later be dismissed as hallucinations brought on by stress and urban legends, never knowing how close they had come to becoming victims of creatures their rational minds insisted could not exist. Sophia lay unconscious in the alley for several minutes, her vital signs so weak that even vampire senses could barely detect them, and Lucian's anguish at her near death resonated through their mating bond with such intensity that every vampire within a mile radius felt echoes of his pain. When she finally regained consciousness, she found Aldrich kneeling beside her with an expression that might have contained the faintest trace of approval, and she understood that the first trial had been designed not just to test her courage, but to demonstrate the authenticity of her bond with Lucian to council members who had doubted that such connections could be real, rather than mere infatuation disguised as destiny. The second trial transported her to a scenario where she faced an impossible choice between saving Lucian's life and preventing a supernatural war that would expose vampire society to human authorities who possessed the technology and resources to hunt their kind to extinction. Elena appeared before her in chains, offering information about a planned attack on vampire safe houses in exchange for Lucian's death, claiming that council hardliners would use any excuse to eliminate progressive vampires who threatened their vision of supernatural supremacy. The scenario was designed to force Sophia to choose between personal love and the greater good, to prove that she could make rational decisions even when those decisions required sacrificing the person she cared about most. Instead of accepting the binary choice presented to her, Sophia used her knowledge of both human and vampire psychology to find a third option, recognizing that the supposed intelligence Elena offered was likely fabricated and that the real threat came from council members who were using the trial as cover for their own political machinations. She negotiated a complex agreement that addressed the underlying tensions between vampire factions while simultaneously protecting both Lucian and the innocent humans who would suffer if supernatural politics spilled into their world, demonstrating wisdom that impressed even the most skeptical council members who had expected her to fail this test of diplomatic skill. The final trial revealed the true scope of Elena's ambitions and the supernatural forces she had allied herself with in her quest for power. The beautiful vampire who had orchestrated the conspiracy against Lucian was revealed to be possessed by an ancient spirit, a vampire lord from the early days of their species who had been destroyed centuries ago, but whose consciousness had survived in fragments that could inhabit and control weaker minds. The spirit had been manipulating Elena for decades, using her jealousy and ambition as tools to reclaim physical form and challenge the modern vampire hierarchy that had replaced the brutal autocracy he had once ruled. Sophia realized that defeating this threat would require entering Lucian's mind through their mating bond, joining her consciousness with his to fight a spiritual battle that could destroy them both if they failed to maintain their connection while under assault from an enemy who possessed centuries more experience with psychic warfare than either of them could claim. Inside Lucian's consciousness, she experienced 800 years of loneliness and sacrifice, felt the weight of responsibility that had shaped every decision he had made since becoming Vampire King, understood the depth of isolation that had marked his existence until the night they met. Together they faced the ancient spirit in combat that transcended physical reality, their combined will proving stronger than the malevolent force that had tried to use their love against them. The effort of defeating such an ancient and powerful enemy left Sophia dying from magical exhaustion that no human constitution could survive, her life force burned away by supernatural energies that had never been meant to flow through mortal channels. Lucian made the ultimate choice without hesitation, offering to surrender his crown and immortality to save her life, proving to the council that their bond was indeed built on selfless love rather than selfish desire, and that sometimes the greatest strength came from being willing to sacrifice everything for another person's survival. The ancient cathedral stood silent in the pale light of approaching dawn, its broken windows casting fractured rainbows across the stone floor, where supernatural forces had battled for the future of both vampire society and the fragile balance between worlds that few humans ever suspected existed. Sophia lay dying in Lucian's arms, her life force ebbing away like water through cracked earth, while the Vampire Council watched with expressions that ranged from curiosity to genuine sorrow for the tragedy unfolding before them. Her breathing had become shallow and irregular, each breath a struggle against the magical exhaustion that was consuming her from within. And even the most powerful healing spells Catherine could weave seemed inadequate against damage that went deeper than flesh and bone to touch the very essence of what made her human. Lucian knelt beside her with 8 centuries of composure shattered by helplessness. His immortal strength useless against an enemy he could not fight or intimidate into submission. And for the first time since his transformation, he found himself contemplating mortality, not as an abstract concept, but as an immediate and devastating reality. He had offered everything to save her, his crown, his immortality, his very existence, but the council could not grant what he asked, because the magical forces that had ravaged her consciousness were beyond their power to reverse or redirect. Aldrich watched this display of desperate love with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, and something in the ancient vampire's expression suggested recognition of patterns that spanned millennia rather than mere decades. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of revelation rather than simple observation, and every creature present understood that they were witnessing something that would reshape supernatural law for generations to come. The willingness of both mates to sacrifice everything for each other had proven something that the council had not seen demonstrated in over 5 centuries, he explained. Evidence of a bond that transcended mere attraction or even deep affection to touch something fundamental about the nature of love itself. Such connections were recognized in the most ancient vampire texts, described in prophecies that most modern vampires dismissed as mythology rather than historical record. But the founders of their species had understood that true evolution sometimes required embracing seemingly impossible transformations. There was another way, Aldrich revealed, a ritual so dangerous and unprecedented that it had been attempted only 3 times in the entire history of vampire civilization, with 2 of those attempts ending in the complete destruction of both participants. The true binding was more than simple transformation from human to vampire, more than the violent exchange of blood that created most of their kind through domination and predatory hunger. This ancient ceremony required absolute trust between participants, perfect synchronization of will and intention, and most dangerously, a willingness to merge not just their physical essences, but their very souls in ways that would make them literally inseparable for all eternity. The human partner would become vampire while retaining their essential humanity, their capacity for growth and change that made mortals so fascinating and unpredictable, while the vampire would gain access to human adaptability and emotional depth that most of their kind lost during the transformation process. The ritual could only be performed during the liminal moments between night and day, when the barriers between life and death were thinnest and supernatural energies flowed with greater intensity than at any other time. Most crucially, both partners had to enter the ceremony knowing that failure would result not just in death, but in the complete obliteration of their souls, leaving nothing behind that could be mourned or remembered. Sophia listened to this explanation through the haze of approaching unconsciousness, her failing body somehow finding strength to focus on words that offered hope where none had existed moments before. She accepted the risks without hesitation, understanding that the choice was not between safety and danger, but between a chance at eternity together and the certainty of separation through death. Lucian's protests died in his throat as he looked into her eyes and saw determination that matched his own, recognition that they had come too far and sacrificed too much to surrender their bond without fighting for it with everything they possessed. The preparation for the true binding required moving to sacred ground that had never been touched by violence or hatred, and Catherine used her considerable magical abilities to transport the entire group to a hilltop clearing where ancient oaks formed a natural circle around a spring that had been flowing since before human civilization reached these lands. The dawn was still an hour away, giving them time to prepare the complex ritual circles and gather the mystical components that would focus supernatural energies with the precision required for such a delicate transformation. Aldrich himself served as the primary celebrant, his ancient knowledge of vampire law extending to ceremonies that had not been performed since the medieval period, while other council members took positions around the circle that would allow them to monitor the process and intervene if something went catastrophically wrong. Catherine and her witch allies wove protective spells that would contain the magical energies and prevent them from spilling into the surrounding countryside where they might affect innocent humans or disrupt the natural balance that kept both worlds stable. As the eastern horizon began to lighten with the first hints of approaching sunrise, Sophia and Lucian took their positions at the center of the ritual circle, their hands clasped together with desperate intensity, while ancient words of power were spoken in languages that predated most human civilizations. The ceremony required them to open their consciousness completely to each other, to remove every barrier and defense that normally protected the mind from invasion or influence, making them vulnerable in ways that went beyond mere physical exposure. Sophia felt Lucian's immortal essence flowing into her awareness like liquid starlight, cold and beautiful and vast beyond human comprehension, while her own mortal warmth spread through his consciousness like sunrise breaking through centuries of perpetual winter. The transformation began as the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern mountains, and Sophia's human physiology began changing at the cellular level as vampire DNA rewrote her genetic code with supernatural precision. But unlike traditional vampire transformation, which destroyed the human soul to make room for predatory instincts, the true binding preserved her essential humanity while adding immortal capabilities that enhanced rather than replaced what she had always been. Her magical abilities, awakened by their mating bond, merged with Lucian's vampire powers to create something unprecedented in supernatural history, a hybrid consciousness that combined human adaptability with immortal wisdom and strength. The process was excruciating and ecstatic simultaneously, every nerve in her body burning with supernatural fire, while her soul expanded to accommodate abilities and awareness that no human mind was designed to contain. Lucian experienced his own transformation as her humanity flowed into the spaces where loneliness and isolation had hollowed out his immortal heart, filling the emptiness that 8 centuries of careful control had created with warmth and connection that made him feel truly alive for the first time since his original transformation. As the sun climbed higher, painting the clearing with golden light that should have been deadly to vampire flesh, both participants began to glow with internal radiance that seemed to come from the fusion of their combined essences. The council members who witnessed this unprecedented event understood immediately that they were seeing the fulfillment of ancient prophecies about vampire evolution, the emergence of a new form of immortal being that combined the best aspects of both species while transcending the limitations that had defined their separate existences. When the transformation finally completed, Sophia rose from the ritual circle as something entirely new, vampire and human, and other all at once, her eyes holding depths that reflected both mortal wisdom and immortal power, while her presence radiated the kind of authority that was earned rather than inherited. 6 months later, the supernatural world had adapted to changes that seemed impossible at the time, but now felt as natural and inevitable as the turning of seasons or the cycle of moon phases. Sophia had assumed her role as vampire queen with grace and intelligence that impressed even her harshest critics, establishing new laws that protected humans from vampire abuse while creating unprecedented alliances between supernatural communities that had been enemies for centuries. Her unique perspective as someone who had been human allowed her to bridge gaps between species that traditional vampire diplomacy had never been able to cross, while her immortal powers commanded the respect necessary to enforce agreements that weaker authorities could never have maintained. Marcus Chen lived a quiet life in a suburban apartment complex, his memories of supernatural encounters carefully edited to remove anything that might drive him back to madness. His days filled with mundane concerns about work schedules and television programs that provided safe structure for a mind that had been permanently damaged by exposure to forces beyond human comprehension. Elena faced eternal imprisonment in the deepest levels of the Vampire Council's secure facilities, her consciousness sealed away from any possibility of escape or influence, while her body remained preserved in case future technologies might offer ways to separate her essence from the ancient spirit that had possessed and corrupted her for so many years. Tobias Reed had surprised everyone by accepting recruitment as a supernatural law enforcement officer, his extensive knowledge of vampire weaknesses proving invaluable in tracking down rogue immortals who threatened the delicate balance that kept their world hidden from human authorities. His transition from hunter to protector had been gradual and sometimes difficult, but his dedication to justice rather than mere revenge had made him an unexpected asset to the same creatures he had once sought to destroy. Maria Rodriguez completed her graduate studies in art history while simultaneously learning to develop magical abilities that had been awakened by her exposure to supernatural energies during the cathedral incident, her training under Catherine's guidance revealing talents that might one day make her one of the most powerful witches of her generation. The restored castle that served as their primary residence perched on cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean, its ancient stones rebuilt with modern technology that preserved historical authenticity while providing contemporary comfort and security systems that could detect supernatural threats from miles away. Lucian and Sophia ruled together with combined authority that made them more powerful than any vampire king in recorded history, their complementary abilities creating synergies that neither could have achieved alone. On this particular evening, they stood, together on the castle's main balcony, watching the sun set over waters that stretched to infinity, while feeling the deep contentment that came from having fought for their love and won the right to spend eternity exploring everything that devotion could create between two souls that had found their perfect match. The transformation that Sophia had undergone was beginning to affect other vampires who spent time in her presence, subtle changes that suggested love might indeed be the key to vampire evolution. The missing element that could allow their species to transcend its predatory origins and become something greater than the sum of its individual hungers. The future stretched before them like an unwritten book, filled with possibilities that neither had dared to imagine during those desperate weeks when their bond had seemed doomed by ancient laws and political pressures. And they faced that future with the confidence of immortal beings who had learned that sometimes the greatest strength came from allowing themselves to be vulnerable enough to love completely. Some called it a fairy tale ending, observers who had witnessed their journey from that humiliating evening in an upscale restaurant to this moment of triumph and transformation. But Sophia knew better, as she felt the steady rhythm of Lucian's unnecessary heartbeat against her cheek and sensed the vast sweep of centuries stretching ahead of them, like an infinite canvas waiting to be painted with shared experiences and deepening connection. It was just the beginning of their forever.